Some nights are not haunted by ghosts. They are haunted by promises that refuse to be forgotten. Every evening, just before darkness settled over the pine-covered mountains of western Montana, the same quiet ritual unfolded outside an isolated log cabin hidden at the edge of an endless forest. A powerful German shepherd named Titan would step onto the weathered wooden porch, lift his head toward the towering pines beyond the gravel driveway, and remain perfectly still. He never barked. He never growled. His ears stood forward, his amber eyes fixed on the same patch of forest as though someone invisible stood patiently among the trees, waiting to be seen. Inside the cabin, Michael Carter had tried for months to ignore the strange habit. At 43 years old, the former United States Marine had learned that some questions only became heavier the longer a man carried them. His life had become deliberately simple after leaving military service. He split firewood every morning, repaired old fences when storms damaged them, drove into town once each week for groceries, and spent quiet evenings reading beside a stone fireplace while soft jazz drifted from an aging radio. Solitude suited him. Silence asked nothing from him. Yet every night, without fail, Titan abandoned the warmth of the cabin just before sunset and walked outside alone. Michael would glance through the front window and find the dog standing exactly where he had stood the night before, watching the forest with complete concentration. At first, Michael assumed deer wandered through the trees after dusk. Then he blamed coyotes. A few evenings later he convinced himself the dog simply enjoyed the cool mountain air. But those explanations slowly began to disappear. The forest remained unnaturally quiet whenever Titan took his place. Birds stopped singing earlier than usual. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the towering pines. One October evening, a steady rain fell across the valley, tapping gently against the cabin roof while mist drifted between the trees like pale ribbons floating above the earth. Michael expected Titan to remain inside beside the fire. Instead, the German shepherd quietly stood, walked to the front door, and waited. Michael opened it without saying a word. Titan stepped into the cold rain as though he had been invited by someone only he could hear. He crossed the porch, descended the 3 wooden steps, and stopped at the edge of the gravel driveway. Rain gathered across his thick black and tan coat, yet he refused to seek shelter. His gaze remained fixed deep within the dark forest. Michael folded his arms beneath his heavy field jacket and stood beside him. "There is nothing out there," he said softly, more to reassure himself than the dog. Titan never looked at him. Several long moments passed beneath the steady rain until something unexpected happened. The German shepherd slowly took 3 careful steps forward before stopping again. He lowered his nose briefly toward the damp ground, then lifted his head and stared into the trees with even greater certainty. Michael followed the direction of his gaze. The forest appeared empty. Only rows of ancient pines disappeared into darkness, their trunks rising like silent pillars beneath a gray autumn sky. Then the breeze shifted. A single metallic sound drifted faintly through the rain. It was almost too quiet to hear, lasting no more than a heartbeat. Not the sound of wildlife. Not falling branches. Something small. Something made by human hands. Titan's ears immediately lifted higher. His breakdown arrow download as audio, Michael Carter followed the faint beam of his flashlight through the towering pines, but after only a few hundred yards Titan suddenly stopped beside a narrow game trail and quietly sat beneath an enormous cedar tree. Rain continued to fall in a gentle rhythm, tapping against thick branches high above while cool mist drifted through the forest like pale ribbons. The German shepherd looked toward the darkness for several more seconds before calmly turning around and walking back toward the cabin as though whatever had drawn him there had simply vanished. Michael searched the surrounding woods with the flashlight, its narrow beam sliding across damp tree trunks, moss-covered stones, and fallen branches glistening beneath the rain. Nothing appeared unusual. No footprints disturbed the soft earth. No abandoned equipment rested among the ferns. Even the mysterious metallic sound had disappeared completely. After several quiet minutes, he followed Titan home without another word. The next morning sunlight spilled across the valley, transforming the storm-soaked landscape into a brilliant display of golden autumn colors. Steam drifted from Michael's mug of black coffee as he stood on the porch watching Titan patrol the property with his usual calm confidence. Looking at the peaceful morning, it became almost impossible to believe the strange events of the previous evening had ever happened. Yet something inside Michael refused to dismiss them. Throughout his years in the Marine Corps he had learned one lesson that had never failed him. Dogs notice details long before people ever did. Titan had earned that trust many times over. 6 years earlier Michael had adopted the young German Shepherd through a military working dog transition program after the dog retired from service. The two had never deployed together, yet they seemed to understand one another from the very beginning. Neither expected unnecessary words. Both preferred quiet routines over crowded places. Over the years Titan became more than a companion. He became the steady presence that filled the empty spaces left behind by a life Michael rarely spoke about. Friends occasionally invited him into town for community events or weekend gatherings, but he usually declined with genuine politeness. He preferred repairing old fences, stacking fresh firewood, tending a modest vegetable garden, or walking forest trails with Titan beside him. The peaceful rhythm allowed memories to settle naturally without demanding attention. Around noon an elderly neighbor named Walter Jensen drove his dusty pickup truck into the driveway carrying fresh apple cider from his orchard. Walter had lived in the valley for more than 50 years and knew nearly every trail winding through the surrounding mountains. As they stood beside the porch sharing cider beneath the warm afternoon sun, Michael casually asked whether anyone had recently been exploring the forest beyond his property. Walter slowly shook his head. "Not that side," he answered. "Most folks stay away from those old pines. They have been quiet longer than I can remember." He smiled gently toward Titan lying peacefully beside the porch steps. "Funny thing though. Every now and then I have seen your dog sitting near that ridge at sunset. Always the same place. Always looking downhill. Thought maybe he was watching elk." Michael glanced toward Titan without responding. Walter eventually climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving the question hanging quietly in the crisp autumn air. That evening, long before sunset, Titan finished his supper, stood from his bowl, and walked directly to the front door without hesitation. This time Michael was already wearing his field jacket and carrying his flashlight before the German Shepherd even looked back. He opened the cabin door with a calm smile. "All right, old friend," he whispered softly. "Tonight, we find out what you have been trying to show me." Titan stepped into the fading light and headed once again toward the waiting forest, but this time he did not choose the same trail as before. Instead, he turned farther north, toward a stand of ancient pines where no path seemed to exist at all. The last glow of daylight faded behind the mountains as Titan moved silently between towering pine trees, weaving through dense patches of ferns and weathered fallen logs with calm determination. Michael Carter followed several yards behind, his flashlight remaining switched off while enough pale evening light filtered through the forest canopy to guide his steps. The German Shepherd never hesitated. He did not search randomly or wander from side to side. Every turn seemed deliberate, every pause measured, as though he had traveled this hidden route countless times before. Michael quietly brushed aside low branches and carefully crossed a narrow stream whose clear water reflected the first stars beginning to appear above the Montana wilderness. The forest carried the familiar scent of damp earth, cedar, and fallen pine needles, while a gentle breeze whispered through ancient branches high overhead. It was a peaceful place, untouched by roads or cabins, where time itself seemed to move more slowly. After nearly 20 minutes, Titan slowed his pace and approached a massive stand of old ponderosa pines rising from a gentle hillside. Their trunks were thick enough that 3 grown men could barely wrap their arms around one. The German Shepherd stopped beside the largest tree, lowered his nose toward the forest floor, and gently nudged aside several layers of damp leaves without digging. Michael walked closer. At first he noticed nothing unusual. Moss-covered scattered rocks. Ferns surrounded exposed roots twisting across the hillside. Then a faint glimmer caught his attention. Something metallic reflected the final light of dusk from beneath the leaves. Michael knelt slowly and brushed away decades of fallen pine needles with both gloved hands. Beneath them rested the corner of a small weathered metal box almost completely hidden beneath roots and rich black soil. Rust covered its surface, and faded olive paint still clung stubbornly to one side despite years beneath the forest floor. Titan quietly stepped backward and sat several feet away, watching without making a sound. Michael stared at the box for a long moment before carefully lifting it free from the earth. It felt surprisingly heavy. Moisture dripped from its rusted lid as he gently wiped away dirt with the sleeve of his jacket. A small brass latch remained intact despite the passing years. Taking a slow breath, Michael pressed it carefully until it released with a soft metallic click that echoed gently through the silent forest. Inside rested 4 carefully preserved objects wrapped inside faded waxed canvas. Michael unfolded the first bundle and discovered a worn marine dog tag suspended from an old steel chain. The engraved letters remained remarkably clear beneath years of silence. The name was unfamiliar. Samuel Whitaker. United States Marine Corps. Michael searched his memory but recognized neither the name nor the service number. Beneath the dog tag lay a small leather notebook secured with frayed cord, its pages yellowed but carefully protected from moisture. Beside it rested a polished brass compass whose needle still pointed steadily north the moment it touched open air. At the very bottom of the box was a faded photograph showing a young Marine standing beside a smiling family in front of a white farmhouse. Their faces reflected ordinary happiness untouched by time. Michael turned the photograph over. Across the back, written in careful blue ink, were only 6 simple words. If found, please finish my promise. A cool breeze drifted across the hillside, gently stirring the surrounding pines until they whispered softly above him. Michael looked toward Titan. The German shepherd remained perfectly calm, his amber eyes fixed not upon the box, but farther uphill beyond the ancient trees. There, almost hidden within the deepening twilight, stood the weathered outline of an old wooden trail marker leaning quietly beneath the branches, pointing toward a destination that no longer appeared on any map Michael had ever seen. Michael carefully closed the metal box before slipping every item into his weathered canvas backpack except the faded photograph, which remained in his hands as he followed Titan toward the forgotten trail marker. Moonlight slowly filtered through the branches, bathing the old sign in a pale silver glow that revealed only a few worn letters carved deep into the wood decades earlier. Most of the words had disappeared beneath years of rain and snow, but one direction remained barely readable. Cedar Hollow. Michael frowned. He had studied topographic maps of this valley countless times since buying the cabin, yet he had never seen that name printed anywhere. Titan quietly stepped onto the narrow path beyond the marker, paused, then looked back as though waiting for Michael to make the decision himself. The former Marine nodded almost instinctively. "Lead on," he whispered. The trail climbed gently through the hillside before opening into a peaceful clearing surrounded by towering pines. Wild grasses swayed beneath the evening breeze, and a circle of smooth stones rested near the center as though someone had once gathered there long ago. Nothing else remained except fragments of an old wooden fence nearly reclaimed by nature. Titan slowly walked around the clearing, his nose close to the ground, before stopping beside a weathered cedar stump. He sat quietly again. No barking. No scratching. Only patient silence. Michael understood that whatever the dog wanted him to discover was not buried here. Instead, this place itself seemed to matter. He removed the small leather notebook from his backpack and carefully untied the frayed cord. The brittle pages released the faint scent of aged paper and cedar. The handwriting inside was steady and deliberate, written by someone accustomed to keeping careful field notes. The first several pages listed dates, weather conditions, and brief observations that resembled ordinary journal entries. Then the writing changed. It became more personal. There were reflections about family, gratitude, and promises waiting to be fulfilled after returning home. No fear. No bitterness. Only quiet hope. Michael turned another page and found a rough hand-drawn map of the surrounding valley. A small star had been placed beside Cedar Hollow, followed by a single sentence. "If I cannot return, someone worthy will find this place one day." Michael looked across the empty clearing. The words settled heavily in his mind because they did not sound desperate. They sounded certain. He continued reading until another page caught his attention. Tucked carefully between two sheets rested a folded receipt from a general store dated more than 20 years earlier in the nearby town of Ashton Ridge. The address was still visible. Michael recognized the town immediately. It was less than 30 miles away and still existed today, although only a few hundred people lived there. Titan suddenly stood and walked toward the edge of the clearing where the moonlight reached between the trees. He lowered his head briefly before lifting it toward the distant valley below. Michael followed his gaze. Far beyond the forest, tiny lights shimmered from scattered homes surrounding Ashton Ridge. For reasons he could not fully explain, the town no longer felt like a random destination. It felt connected to every object resting inside the old metal box. He slipped the notebook back into his backpack, carefully placed the photograph inside its protective pocket, and held Samuel Whitaker's dog tag tightly in his hand for a quiet moment. The cool metal carried no answers, yet somehow it no longer felt abandoned. As Michael looked once more across the moonlit clearing, a gentle breeze turned the old trail marker behind him just enough for another weathered word to become visible beneath years of faded paint. It was not the name of a place. It was a family name. Whitaker. The following morning arrived with clear blue skies stretching across the Montana Valley, and for the first time in many months Michael Carter abandoned his usual routine without hesitation. The stack of firewood remained untouched beside the cabin. The vegetable garden could wait another day. Whatever had begun beneath those ancient pines now demanded every ounce of his attention. Titan seemed to understand. The German Shepherd stood beside the old pickup truck before sunrise, his tail still, his amber eyes following every movement as Michael carefully placed the weathered metal box, the leather notebook, the brass compass, the faded photograph, and Samuel Whitaker's dog tag inside a padded canvas satchel resting on the passenger seat. The drive to Ashton Ridge took less than an hour, winding through narrow mountain roads lined with golden aspens, weathered barns, and grazing cattle scattered across broad pastures. It was one of those small American towns where nearly everyone waved at passing vehicles and the church steeple remained the tallest building for miles. Main Street held only a handful of businesses, including a diner, a hardware store, a barber shop, and an old general store whose faded wooden sign matched the name printed on the receipt Michael had found inside the notebook. He parked across the street and stepped onto the sidewalk with Titan walking quietly at his side. Several people smiled at the handsome German Shepherd as they passed, but Titan remained unusually focused, lifting his nose into the cool morning air before glancing toward the general store. The brass bell above the entrance chimed softly as Michael pushed open the door. Warm light filled the room, carrying the comforting scent of cedar shelves, fresh coffee, and old paper. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman arranging jars of homemade preserves. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and gentle wrinkles framed kind blue eyes that seemed to notice every detail without hurry. She welcomed Michael with a warm smile until he carefully placed Samuel Whitaker's dog tag on the wooden counter. Her expression changed instantly. The smile faded, replaced by quiet disbelief. She reached forward with trembling fingers but stopped just short of touching the metal. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Finally she whispered, almost to herself, "I never thought I would see that again." Michael remained silent, allowing the moment to breathe. The woman slowly looked toward Titan, whose calm gaze never left her face. Tears quietly gathered in her eyes. "You found this together," she said softly. It was not a question. Michael nodded once. She introduced herself as Evelyn Brooks, explaining that her family had owned the general store for nearly 50 years. When Michael asked whether she knew Samuel Whitaker, she closed the store door, turned the sign to closed, and invited him to sit near the front window where morning sunlight warmed the old wooden floor. She carefully lifted the dog tag into her hands with remarkable tenderness, as though greeting an old friend instead of a forgotten object. Samuel was one of the finest young men this town ever raised, she began. He promised everyone he would come home after his service. He believed promises were sacred. She looked down at the weathered chain resting across her palms before adding with quiet sadness, but one autumn he simply disappeared. No one ever learned why. Some believed he left because he wanted a new life somewhere else. Others believed he became lost in those mountains. His parents waited until the very end of their lives, hoping someone would knock on their door with an answer. Michael slowly removed the faded family photograph from his satchel and placed it beside the dog tag. Evelyn covered her mouth with one hand as fresh tears rolled gently down her cheeks. "That is them," she whispered. "That is the Whitaker family." Then she looked directly at Michael with a mixture of hope and astonishment. "If you found the photograph, then there is something else you have not discovered yet, because Samuel always said the most important promise could never fit inside a box." For several quiet moments Michael Carter simply listened as the old clock behind the counter marked the passing seconds with a gentle ticking that seemed louder than usual. Evelyn Brooks carefully placed Samuel Whitaker's dog tag beside the faded photograph before opening a small drawer beneath the register. From inside she removed a yellowed newspaper clipping folded neatly along its edges. The paper had become brittle with age, but one photograph remained perfectly clear. It showed a much younger Samuel standing in front of the same general store, smiling beside his parents during a community harvest festival. Michael compared the face in the newspaper to the one in the photograph from the metal box. There was no doubt they were the same man. Evelyn slid the clipping across the counter. "He came here every Saturday morning," she said softly. "Always bought fresh bread for his mother before driving back to the family farm. He believed small acts of kindness mattered just as much as the big ones." Titan quietly rested beside Michael's chair, but the German shepherd suddenly lifted his head the moment Evelyn mentioned the farm. His ears leaned forward with unmistakable attention. Evelyn noticed immediately. She smiled through tired eyes. "Your friend keeps listening whenever I speak about Samuel." Michael gently scratched behind Titan's ears without taking his eyes from the newspaper. "He has been leading me ever since this started," he answered. Evelyn nodded slowly, as though the idea did not surprise her at all. She walked toward an old bulletin board hanging near the back of the store and removed a faded county map secured beneath clear plastic. Her finger traced a narrow country road leading east of town until it stopped beside a weathered handwritten note. "Whitaker Farm. No one has lived there for years," she explained. "After Samuel disappeared, his parents stayed as long as they could. When they both passed away, the property was left untouched. Most people simply forgot it was there." Michael unfolded the leather notebook once more and carefully compared the hand-drawn map inside with the county map on the wall. Every creek, ridge, and winding road matched almost perfectly. Only one location appeared in the notebook that the county map did not show. A tiny cross drawn beside an old oak tree beyond the farmhouse. There were no words beside it. Only the symbol. Michael quietly looked toward Evelyn. "Do you know what this mark means?" She studied the page for several moments before slowly shaking her head. "No," she admitted. "But Samuel always carried that brass compass with him. He once joked that maps only tell you where roads exist. A compass tells you where your heart is supposed to go." The words lingered in the warm afternoon air. Michael reached into the satchel and removed the polished brass compass. The needle settled steadily north before giving one slow, unexpected tremble. Then it shifted several degrees east, refusing to return to true north. Michael frowned. He gently rotated the compass in his hands, expecting the needle to correct itself, but it remained fixed toward the same direction shown by the small cross inside Samuel's notebook. Titan quietly stood. Without hesitation the German shepherd walked to the front door and waited beside it, his eyes focused beyond the glass toward the rolling hills outside town. Michael had seen that look before. It was the same calm certainty Titan carried beneath the ancient pines. Evelyn glanced from the dog to the compass and then back to Michael. A quiet smile touched her face. "I think Samuel has been waiting a very long time for someone willing to finish what he started," she whispered. Michael carefully gathered every keepsake into the canvas satchel, thanked Evelyn for her kindness, and stepped into the cool afternoon sunlight with Titan walking faithfully beside him. As the pickup truck rolled east toward the abandoned Whitaker farm, neither of them noticed an elderly man standing silently across the street beneath the shade of an old maple tree, watching the departing vehicle with unmistakable recognition in his eyes. The road to the Whitaker farm narrowed into a single ribbon of cracked pavement before giving way to an old gravel lane lined with cottonwood trees whose golden leaves drifted lazily across the hood of Michael Carter's pickup. The afternoon sun hung low above the Montana hills, casting long shadows that stretched across open fields where weathered fences leaned with quiet dignity after decades of faithful service. Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed ahead with the same calm certainty that had guided every step since the night he first disappeared into the forest. Michael noticed that the brass compass resting on the dashboard still refused to point true north. Its needle remained steady toward the eastern pasture beyond the abandoned farmhouse. When they reached the property, the silence felt different from the silence surrounding Michael's cabin. This place carried memories instead of loneliness. The old white farmhouse stood beneath enormous oak trees, its paint faded by countless summers and winters, while a red barn rested quietly beyond a field now covered with tall grass swaying beneath the afternoon breeze. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing suggested fear or tragedy. It simply looked like a home that had been waiting far longer than anyone expected. Michael stepped from the truck and looked around slowly. Titan immediately began walking toward the back pasture instead of the house. He did not run. He simply followed an invisible path through the grass until he reached an enormous oak tree standing alone near the crest of a gentle hill. Beneath its wide branches the German shepherd stopped beside a weathered stone almost hidden beneath moss. Michael recognized the shape immediately. It was not a natural rock. It was an old boundary marker. He removed Samuel Whitaker's notebook once more and opened it to the page containing the small hand-drawn cross. The drawing matched the landscape perfectly. The compass needle pointed directly toward the marker. Michael knelt beside the stone and carefully cleared away years of leaves and moss with his gloved hands. As more of the surface appeared, faint carved letters slowly emerged from beneath the dirt. They were almost impossible to read until sunlight reached across the hill at just the right angle. Family keeps its promises. Michael remained motionless. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that could not be measured. Titan quietly rested beside him, placing one paw gently against the edge of the stone as though confirming they had reached the place Samuel intended someone to find. Just then the sound of a slow-moving vehicle climbed the gravel lane behind them. Michael turned to see the same elderly man who had watched him leave Ashton Ridge pulling his old pickup beside the pasture gate. He stepped out carefully, removed his worn cowboy hat, and approached with measured steps. His face reflected surprise, relief, and sadness all at once. "I thought someone might finally come," he said in a gentle voice. "My name is Harold Benson. Samuel and I grew up together." Michael introduced himself before quietly showing him the marine dog tag. Harold closed his eyes for a long moment before nodding slowly. "He kept his promise after all," he whispered. They stood together beneath the oak while the breeze carried the scent of dry grass across the hillside. Harold looked toward the farmhouse before speaking again. "People believed Samuel disappeared because he walked away from his family. That was never true. He stayed away because someone trusted him with something that could protect an entire family from losing everything they had. He never broke that trust, even when it cost him the chance to come home. Michael listened without interrupting. Every piece of the story finally began fitting together. Samuel had not vanished into darkness. He had chosen silence over recognition because another family's future mattered more than his own reputation. Titan slowly lifted his head toward Harold, and the old man smiled through eyes beginning to fill with tears. "That dog," he said softly, "looks at people exactly the way Samuel used to. Like he already knows the good they have not discovered inside themselves yet." Harold Benson remained beneath the great oak until the evening light began turning the hillsides gold, then he slowly reached inside the pocket of his old denim jacket and removed a small brass key attached to a faded strip of blue ribbon. He placed it gently into Michael Carter's hand without hesitation. "Samuel gave me this more than 20 years ago," he said quietly. "He told me never to use it unless someone arrived carrying his dog tag. I thought I would take that promise with me to my own grave." Michael looked at the worn key, then toward the abandoned farmhouse standing peacefully across the pasture. Harold nodded once. "There is a small workshop behind the barn. Nobody has opened it since the day Samuel left." Titan was already walking toward the weathered red barn before either man moved. The German shepherd crossed the tall grass with calm confidence until he stopped beside a modest wooden building tucked behind the larger structure. Time had faded its paint, but the little workshop still stood proudly beneath the shelter of 2 old maple trees. Michael inserted the brass key into the rusted lock. It resisted at first before turning with a quiet click that echoed softly through the still afternoon air. The door opened slowly, releasing the familiar scent of aged cedar, machine oil, and dry wood. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight pouring from a small window near the roof. Inside, everything remained exactly as though its owner had simply stepped outside for a few minutes. Hand tools hung neatly along the walls. A carpenter's bench stood perfectly organized. Shelves held carefully labeled jars filled with nails, screws, and polished hardware. Nothing suggested abandonment. It felt preserved by intention rather than forgotten by time. Titan entered quietly and walked directly toward an old oak cabinet standing against the far wall. He sat beside it and looked patiently at Michael. Harold smiled with quiet amazement. "He knows," he whispered. Michael opened the cabinet doors and found several carefully stacked wooden boxes, each bearing handwritten labels with family names from Ashton Ridge. Beneath them rested a large leather portfolio wrapped in clean canvas. He carried it gently onto the workbench and loosened the worn leather straps. Inside were property deeds, handwritten agreements, family letters, and signed documents proving that years earlier Samuel had quietly protected several neighboring farms by safeguarding legal records during a devastating financial dispute that threatened to strip local families of their land. Rather than seeking recognition, he had chosen to keep the documents hidden until every disagreement had peacefully ended, honoring confidential promises made to those who trusted him. One envelope rested separately at the very bottom. Across its front Samuel had written only one sentence. "When every family is safe, bring these home." Michael slowly unfolded the letter inside. Samuel explained that no single person should receive credit for kindness that belonged to an entire community. He believed promises became stronger when they protected others instead of elevating oneself. He ended with one final request. "If someone ever finds this, let my parents know I never stopped coming home in my heart." Harold quietly removed his glasses and wiped tears from his eyes. Neither man spoke for several moments. The silence no longer carried mystery. It carried peace. Within days the carefully preserved documents were delivered to the families whose names appeared on the boxes. Many had never known the full story behind their grandparents' gratitude or why old neighbors always spoke Samuel Whitaker's name with quiet respect. The town gathered on the lawn beside the little white church at the center of Ashton Ridge, where Samuel's photograph, his marine dog tag, and the restored brass compass rested beside an American flag beneath the warm autumn sun. Titan lay calmly near the front row throughout the simple ceremony, never seeking attention, never leaving Michael's side. As church bells echoed gently across the valley, the brass compass resting beside Samuel's photograph made one slow movement, then settled perfectly toward true north for the first time since the journey had begun. 1 year later, the first cool breeze of autumn drifted once again through the pine forest surrounding Michael Carter's cabin, carrying the familiar scent of cedar, fallen leaves, and wood smoke across the quiet Montana valley. Life had gently returned to its peaceful rhythm, yet something within that rhythm had changed forever. Every Saturday morning Michael still drove into Ashton Ridge for groceries, but now each visit lasted a little longer. He no longer hurried back to the solitude of the mountains. He shared coffee with Harold Benson on the porch of the general store, exchanged stories with Evelyn Brooks, and watched children race their bicycles along Main Street while neighbors greeted one another by name. The town no longer felt like a place he passed through. It had quietly become part of his own story. Inside the cabin, the old stone fireplace burned with its familiar warmth as evening settled beyond the windows. Resting upon the wooden mantel were 3 objects placed carefully beside one another. Samuel Whitaker's marine dog tag. The polished brass compass that now pointed faithfully north without hesitation. And the faded family photograph, preserved inside a simple handcrafted cedar frame Michael had built himself during the long winter evenings. Beneath them rested a small handwritten note copied from Samuel's letter. Family keeps its promises. Michael often found himself reading those words without realizing it. They reminded him that honor was not measured by medals displayed on a wall or recognition spoken from a stage. Sometimes honor lived quietly inside promises that no one else ever witnessed. Titan had changed as well, although not in any way most people would notice. The German shepherd no longer stood silently on the porch every evening staring into the forest beyond the cabin. Instead, just before sunset, he would walk to the edge of the driveway, pause for a single peaceful moment beneath the towering pines, and then calmly return inside without looking back. It was as though the silent duty that had rested upon him for so long had finally been fulfilled. One crisp October afternoon Michael decided to revisit the old clearing near Cedar Hollow where everything had begun. Titan walked beside him with an easy stride, stopping beneath the great ponderosa pine where the weathered metal box had rested for so many years. The earth had already begun covering the place again with fresh pine needles, leaving almost no sign that anything extraordinary had ever happened there. Nature had quietly reclaimed the secret, just as it always did. Michael smiled softly before placing his hand against the rough bark of the ancient tree. "He made it home," he whispered. The wind answered by gently stirring the branches high above, filling the forest with the peaceful sound of whispering needles. Titan sat beside him without making a sound. For several long moments they simply listened together. Then the German shepherd slowly rested his head against Michael's leg, his warm breath rising gently into the cool mountain air. Michael reached down and scratched behind his ears with the same quiet gratitude he had carried every day since following those mysterious footprints into the forest. As they turned toward the trail leading home, the late afternoon sunlight broke through the trees, casting 2 long shadows across the forest floor. One belonged to a former Marine. The other belonged to the loyal companion who had refused to let an old promise disappear beneath the weight of passing years. They stretched side by side between the towering pines before gradually blending into the golden light of autumn, leaving behind only silence, grace, and the quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles are not found by those searching for answers, but by those willing to follow a faithful heart all the way home.